Mr. Henry had been eating at the same diner for years. Every day, around noon, he would enter the quiet establishment, his weathered face obscured by a cap, his movements deliberate but slow. The same routine, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating, was all that he knew after so many years of solitude. He never ordered anything fancy. A simple cup of coffee, a bowl of soup, or a sandwich, nothing more. The world outside seemed to move in a blur, a place where he didn't quite belong. It wasn't that he hated being alone, after all, he'd spent a lifetime learning to enjoy his own company. But every so often, he couldn't help but feel the weight of time pressing down on him. He wasn't always this way. There was a time, long ago, when he was a young man full of ambition, a time when laughter filled his life and others' lives alongside him. That was before the war, before so many things were lost. He'd served in Vietnam, been one of the many soldiers who had seen horrors few could ever imagine. It wasn't just the physical wounds that haunted him, it was the memories, the faces of those who hadn't made it back. But life had gone on for everyone else, hadn't it? They had families, friends, and futures. He had his memories. Now, he found himself staring out the diner window each day, watching cars rush past and people talking, laughing, living. His only companions were the occasional waitress who would smile at him as she took his order, never staying too long to engage. Most of them were too busy to notice him, just another old man who came in for a quiet lunch. There was a certain comfort in this, a peace in the predictable cycle of his days. It was easier not to disrupt the flow of things, easier to stay quiet, keep to himself. On this particular day, it felt a little different. The sun shone brightly outside, casting a warm glow through the diner's windows. Mr. Henry sat at his usual booth, the one near the back, where he could keep to himself and survey the room unnoticed. His eyes, however, were not focused on the world outside, they were glued to the plate of food in front of him, a half-finished sandwich. The diner was busier than usual, and a new waitress had started her shift. He noticed her from the moment she walked in. Young, vibrant, full of energy, her presence was like a jolt of electricity in the otherwise sleepy atmosphere of the diner. She moved quickly between tables, a blur of motion, but there was something in the way she carried herself that caught his attention. Her name was Maria. He didn't know this at first, of course. He never bothered to ask the names of waitresses. He wasn't much of a talker. But Maria's face, her bright smile, her enthusiasm, was impossible to ignore. She didn't just take orders, she seemed to care about her customers, noticing the little things that others missed. When she came to his table, there was no rushed smile, no quick transaction. She lingered for a moment, her eyes softening as she looked at him, as if she could see something behind the layers of time etched on his face. "Anything I can get you today, sir?" she asked, her voice light, warm. Mr. Henry blinked, a bit startled by her tone, as if she were a part of the scenery rather than someone about to take his order. He nodded, offering a faint smile. "Just the usual. A cup of coffee, and a bowl of soup. No need to rush." She nodded, but then paused, as if she were debating something. After a moment, she sat down across from him, startling him even further. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mr. Henry was taken aback. It wasn't that he minded the company, it had simply never happened before. No one ever sat with him. In fact, he had grown so accustomed to his solitude that he didn't know what to do when someone offered to break it. "Sure. I suppose," he muttered, unsure of how to react. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the weight of his years more acutely in that moment. Maria looked at him, her gaze soft and curious. "You come here every day, don't you? I've noticed you sitting by yourself." Mr. Henry nodded slowly, unsure of how to explain his presence, his daily ritual. "It's just easier that way," he said. "You get used to it, you know." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I get it. Sometimes, it's nice to be alone. But, well, I've noticed you here all the time. I figured you might want some company. If you don't mind, that is." He was surprised. People didn't care about him. They didn't care about the old man who ate alone, who didn't have much to say. It had been years since anyone had cared enough to even acknowledge him in such a way. He studied Maria for a moment, unsure of what she saw in him. What was it that made her stop? "I guess you could say I've grown used to it," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Things change, but not much." There was a moment of silence as Maria absorbed his words. She didn't rush to fill the quiet space with words, instead choosing to sit with him. The sounds of clinking dishes and chatter from other tables faded into the background as they sat there. Maria looked around at the other patrons in the diner. Most were focused on their own meals, wrapped up in their own lives. "I've been here a week now," she said, breaking the silence. "It's different, you know. Working in a place like this. You meet so many different people. Some are nice, some, well, not so much." Mr. Henry chuckled softly, though it was a sad sound, one that seemed to come from a place deep inside of him. "The world's changed a lot, hasn't it? Some days, it feels like I don't recognize it." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I think that's why I wanted to sit with you. I could tell you've seen a lot. Maybe we could talk, if you want. I don't know much about you, but you seem like you have stories to tell." Stories. Mr. Henry hadn't thought about them in years. He'd tucked those stories away, locked them up in a place where no one could touch them. The memories of war, of losing his comrades, of a life full of regrets, it was all buried beneath layers of time and silence. He wasn't sure he was ready to pull it all out. But there was something about Maria that made him feel safe enough to consider it, even if just for a moment. He looked at her, then down at his soup, which had grown cold. He sighed, a deep, weary sigh, and nodded. Maybe there's a story or two. But I don't know if you'll want to hear them." Maria smiled gently, a smile that said more than words ever could. "I think I would." And so, for the first time in years, Mr. Henry began to share a piece of his past with someone. It wasn't much, just a small fragment, but it was enough. As the minutes ticked by, a small, unspoken bond began to form. Maria didn't push him for more than he was willing to give. She simply listened, offering an understanding ear, which was more than most people had ever given him. For once, he felt seen, not as an old man, not as a veteran, but as a person with a history, with a soul. The diner's noise faded into the background as they sat together, two people from different worlds, yet strangely connected in that quiet, unremarkable moment. And for the first time in years, Mr. Henry didn't feel quite so alone. As the days passed, Mr. Henry found himself looking forward to his time at the diner more than he had in years. He never expected it, but the quiet moments spent in Maria's company began to feel like a reprieve from the weight of solitude he had carried for so long. Each time she came to take his order, they'd exchange a few words, and gradually, Mr. Henry started sharing more, telling her little snippets of his life, stories from his time in Vietnam, memories of a family long lost, and the heartbreak of watching the world move on while he stood still. Maria listened with a patience he hadn't known in a long time. She never rushed him, never judged the pain that surfaced in his voice or the silence that followed. She simply let him talk, and in those quiet moments, something shifted inside him. He had never been one to seek out company. His life had been one of seclusion, a self-imposed isolation that had started after the war and had only deepened over the years. He had tried, in the early years, to find a sense of belonging again, to reconnect with the world he had once known. But the people he encountered couldn't understand the things he had seen, the things he had lost. His friends had moved on, his family had gone, and eventually, he had stopped trying. His days had become a blur, filled with the monotony of routine. Work, meals, sleep, the cycle repeated itself until it seemed like his entire life had shrunk to the size of a diner booth and a cup of coffee. But Maria was different. She was young, full of energy, and optimistic, qualities that had slowly been drained from him over the years. When she sat with him, he could feel the faintest spark of something he hadn't felt in decades, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, life had more to offer than the long, endless stretches of solitude he had resigned himself to. For her, it was a simple act of kindness. For him, it was a lifeline. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, Maria sat down across from him as usual. But today, there was something different about her. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of concern, her brow furrowed in a way that made Mr. Henry pause. She seemed lost in thought, not her usual bubbly self. It made him wonder what was going on in her life. He had learned so much about her in the past few weeks, how she had recently moved to town, how she had been working. Maria had been the one to sit with him, to listen to him, and now he was trying to return the favor. But he knew that his words, no matter how well-intentioned, were not enough. There was a storm in her eyes, a quiet desperation that he couldn't ignore. The following week, things took a turn for the worse. Maria's shifts had become longer, her fatigue more evident. She seemed more withdrawn each day, her smile becoming a little more forced. Mr. Henry noticed the change, of course. He couldn't help but see it, even if she tried to hide it. The lightness she once had was fading, and it pained him to see it. He wanted to do something more for her, something that might help ease her burden, but he didn't know what. He couldn't exactly fix her problems, he didn't even know where to begin. Then one day, something happened that would change everything. It was a quiet afternoon, the diner nearly empty save for a few regulars. Mr. Henry had just finished his soup and was sipping his coffee when Maria came over to his booth, but this time, she didn't have the usual warmth in her eyes. Her expression was serious, almost troubled, and it struck him with a sense of urgency. "Mr. Henry," she began, her voice shaky, "I need to talk to you about something." He set his coffee cup down, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What's going on, Maria?" She looked around, as though making sure no one was listening, before she leaned in closer. "I've been keeping something from you. Something I should have told you earlier, but I didn't know how. I'm in trouble. Real trouble." Mr. Henry sat up straighter, his senses on high alert. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, his heart beginning to race. Maria swallowed hard, then looked him straight in the eye. "I'm in debt. A lot of debt. I've been trying to pay it off, but it's only getting worse. And now they're threatening to hurt me if I don't come up with the money." Mr. Henry's heart sank. He had known something was off, but he never expected this. He knew about the harshness of life, he had experienced his share of hardship, but hearing Maria's pain in those few words hit him like a blow to the chest. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The only thing he could think of was how much she had carried all alone, how much she had hidden from everyone, and how little he had done to help. "Who's threatening you?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Maria hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I can't say yet, but I will. I just needed to tell someone, and you've been the only one to listen. You've been so kind, Mr. Henry. I don't know what to do." For the first time in a long while, Mr. Henry felt that same rush of helplessness he had experienced years ago, when he had been in the thick of battle, when things seemed hopeless and there was no way out. He had been trained to fight, but this was different. This was a battle he couldn't win with just his fists. But for Maria, he would try. He didn't know what he could do, but he would do whatever it took. She had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, someone who cared. It was time he did the same for her. As the diner continued on around them, the world seemed to slow down, and for the first time in ages, Mr. Henry felt a sense of purpose stir within him. He wasn't going to let this young woman face her troubles alone. Not if he could help it. And so, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the small town, Mr. Henry made a vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to make sure Maria didn't have to fight her battles alone. No one should have to carry that weight by themselves, not now, not ever again. The story of their unlikely friendship had only just begun. The days that followed Maria's revelation weighed heavily on Mr. Henry's mind. Each morning, he found himself waking with a tight knot in his stomach, the uncertainty of how to help her clouding his thoughts. He had lived his life with the quiet conviction that there was no room for weakness, no room for relying on others. He had survived because he had learned to be self-sufficient, learned to fight his own battles and carry his burdens alone. But Maria's struggle was different. It was a fight he couldn't win for her, not in the way he had won battles in his youth, not with strength or with courage. No, this time it was about something far more complex, something he wasn't sure he could navigate. But he had promised her. And that promise had ignited something inside him, an unexpected spark of hope, a reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, his life wasn't just about the past, about the things he had lost, but also about the people he could still protect, the lives he could still impact. He might not have all the answers, but he knew that whatever this was, whatever lay ahead, he couldn't just stand by and watch Maria fight her battles alone. It wasn't long before he decided to confront the situation head-on. He had spent years avoiding complications, hiding from the world outside of his small routine, but now, it seemed like the world had forced its way into his life, dragging him from the shadows and into the light. Whether he liked it or not, he was involved in something much bigger than himself, and for the first time in a long while, he realized that was okay. He wasn't just an observer in his own life anymore. He was part of the story. The following afternoon, after another long shift, Maria sat with Mr. Henry once again. She seemed to be growing more withdrawn by the day, the weight of her worries showing in her posture and the dark circles under her eyes. It was clear that the stress was taking its toll, but she tried to hide it, tried to put on that same smile she had worn before. But it wasn't the same smile. This one didn't quite reach her eyes, and Mr. Henry could see through it. "Maria," he said gently, his voice steady, "you can't keep carrying this by yourself. We need to find a way to handle this together." She sighed, leaning back in her chair, looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I wish it were that simple, Mr. Henry. You don't know these people. I can't just make them go away. I've tried to make payments, to get on top of it, but I'm drowning. Every time I think I'm almost there, something new comes up, and the debt just keeps getting worse." He nodded, understanding more than she realized. Debt was something he knew all too well, a burden that never seemed to lift. It had gnawed at him during his years of service, when he had come back from the war and found himself lost in a world that didn't understand him. Bills piled up, his future seemed uncertain, and all he could do was scrape by, one day at a time. But this was different. Maria wasn't just trying to survive. She was living in constant fear of what would happen if she couldn't meet her obligations. That kind of pressure, he had seen it destroy people before. "I may not know everything about your situation," he said slowly, "but I know what it's like to feel like you're out of options. I know what it's like to carry that weight and not know where to turn." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. "But I don't have anyone to help me, Mr. Henry. No family, no friends who can step in. I've been on my own for so long, and I thought I could handle it, but now, I don't know." "I didn't have anyone either," he replied softly. "But I learned something. Sometimes, all you need is one person. Just one. And if that person is willing to stand by you, no matter what, then you don't have to carry it all on your own. I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm not saying I have all the answers. But we can figure this out together." Maria was silent for a long moment, looking down at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Mr. Henry waited, giving her the space to process his words. He knew how stubborn people could be when it came to accepting help, especially people like Maria, proud, independent, and reluctant to burden others. But he also knew that sometimes, the greatest act of strength was allowing yourself to lean on someone else, to trust that they would help carry the load. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally spoke. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Mr. Henry. These people, they're dangerous. If they find out I've talked to anyone, it could get worse." "I've faced danger before," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "I'm not afraid of them." It wasn't a lie. In his younger years, he had fought on foreign soil, fought for his life and the lives of those around him. He had seen things no one should ever have to witness. He had walked through hell and come back. This was a different kind of fight, but it wasn't one he would back down from. Maria seemed to study him for a long moment, as though trying to gauge whether or not she could trust him. She was calculating, weighing her options, and Mr. Henry could see the battle waging inside her. She didn't want to admit it, but she was desperate. And maybe, just maybe, he was the lifeline she had been searching for all along. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you everything. But you have to promise me something, Mr. Henry. Promise me you'll stay out of it if things get dangerous. Promise me you won't get involved." He nodded firmly. "I promise." Maria took a deep breath, then began to tell him everything. She spoke of the loan she had taken out to cover medical bills for her mother, who had fallen ill shortly after they had moved to town. She had thought it was a manageable amount, something she could pay back in time, but the interest rates had been astronomical. Soon, the debt had spiraled out of control. The loan sharks, ruthless men who had no qualms about threatening people, had started calling, sending intimidating messages, and showing up at her apartment late at night. At first, she had tried to keep them at bay with promises of payment, but the threats had escalated. One man, in particular, had taken a special interest in her. He was a tall, menacing figure, someone who seemed to be everywhere, watching her every move. She hadn't known how deep she was in until it was too late, until she realized that she wasn't just owing money. She was now indebted to people who would stop at nothing to get what they were owed, even if it meant destroying her life in the process. By the time Maria finished telling him everything, the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Mr. Henry could feel the tension in the room, the suffocating reality of her situation pressing down on them both. It was more than just money at stake now. It was her safety, her future, her very life. The world she had been trying to keep together was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But as she finished, something inside Mr. Henry stirred. He had never been one to sit idly by, especially when someone he cared about was in danger. He had always believed in fighting for what mattered, and now, Maria mattered. He would do whatever it took to help her. He didn't know how he was going to fix this. He didn't know where this would lead or how dangerous it might get. But he did know one thing: he couldn't let her face it alone. Not now, not ever again. As he stood up from the booth, a new resolve set in. "We're going to get you out of this, Maria," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "I'll make sure of it." The journey ahead was going to be difficult. There would be no easy answers, no quick fixes. But one thing was certain: this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. And together, they would find a way to face it head-on. For the first time in a long while, Mr. Henry felt the stirring of purpose in his chest. He wasn't just a bystander in this world anymore. He was part of the solution. And that was a feeling worth fighting for. The next few days unfolded with a sense of urgency that neither Maria nor Mr. Henry had anticipated. As they carefully mapped out their strategy, a quiet tension settled between them. Each step felt like a tightrope walk, and neither could afford to slip. Maria's heart raced each time she heard a car outside, every knock on the door sending her into a silent panic. She had no choice now but to rely on Mr. Henry, the man she had come to trust in a way she hadn't trusted anyone in years. His calm demeanor, his quiet resolve, had given her the strength to face what seemed insurmountable. But deep down, she knew that the situation was growing more dangerous by the day. The reality of their plan hit them both like a wave crashing against the shore. Mr. Henry had no real experience in dealing with criminals like the ones Maria had described, loan sharks with a violent streak and a complete disregard for human decency. He had fought battles in foreign lands, but nothing had prepared him for this fight, not even the toughest of wars. The enemies here were invisible, sneaky, and they had a way of making people disappear, or worse, making them pay in ways that couldn't be undone. Still, he was determined. His military training had taught him that preparation was the key to survival, that an opponent could be outsmarted if you had the right information. He had spent countless nights researching loan sharking operations, tracking down the identities of these men, learning everything he could about their methods. And with Maria's help, they had slowly begun to build a strategy to take back control of her life. It was a risk, a dangerous, reckless risk, but it was the only way they saw out. Maria had agreed to his plan with visible reluctance, but the desperation in her eyes left no room for hesitation. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, and most of all, tired of being afraid. But the fear she now carried was different. It wasn't the fear of what could happen if she didn't act. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of facing these men head-on and not knowing what they might do in retaliation. The fear of putting not just her own life at risk, but also Mr. Henry's. The turning point came one afternoon, a week into their planning, when Maria received a call from a number she didn't recognize. It wasn't unusual for the loan sharks to use disposable phones, and when she saw the unfamiliar area code, she knew immediately what it was. Her heart sank in her chest as she handed the phone to Mr. Henry, who had been sitting quietly beside her in the small cafe they had claimed as their base of operations. They had decided that it was safer to meet in public places, away from her apartment, where the shadows of her debt lurked at every corner. Mr. Henry answered the phone with a calm, collected voice. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low and smooth, laced with an undertone of menace that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "We know what you're doing, old man," the voice said, dripping with venom. "If you think you can protect her, you're wrong. No one gets in our way." Mr. Henry's grip on the phone tightened, his pulse quickening, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You're making a mistake. Maria's not going anywhere. You can't intimidate her anymore." There was a brief, eerie silence on the other end, then a soft chuckle. "Intimidation? No. This is just a warning. The next time you interfere, you'll regret it." With that, the call ended. Mr. Henry didn't say a word at first, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. Maria, who had been silently listening, felt the chill run down her spine. She had always known that the threats were more than just words, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all too real. These men were willing to go to extremes, and it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, control, and fear. The conversation changed everything. It was no longer just about the money she owed or the debt she had to repay. It was about survival. These people wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and if they couldn't get it from Maria, they'd find another way to take it. The stakes had been raised. Over the next few days, the quiet calm that had briefly settled over Maria was shattered. She started noticing things: strange cars parked across the street, a figure lingering at the end of the alley when she walked home, the subtle shift in atmosphere whenever she entered a room. It was like they were always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Maria began to withdraw even further into herself. She didn't want to put Mr. Henry in any more danger. He had already done more than she could ever ask of him. She had grown attached to him in a way that surprised her. His kindness, his calm nature, and the way he had stood by her when everyone else had turned away, these things had meant more than she was willing to admit. But she couldn't let him sacrifice his safety for her. She had to end this, once and for all, and she had to do it alone. One night, unable to sleep, Maria snuck out of her apartment and drove to a nearby park. It was empty, the streets quiet, the only sound being the distant hum of passing traffic. She parked her car in the lot and sat there for a long time, staring out into the darkness. She knew that she had reached a crossroads. Either she continued to let these men control her, or she took control of her own life, no matter the cost. As she sat there, the weight of her decision pressing down on her, she heard a knock on her car window. Startled, she jerked her head to the side, her heart leaping into her throat. There, standing in the glow of the streetlight, was Mr. Henry. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering. He didn't wait for her to answer, instead opening the car door and slipping inside beside her. "Maria, you don't have to face this alone." Her eyes filled with tears, the dam breaking at last. She had wanted to protect him, to shield him from the dangers she faced, but now, in that moment, she realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep him out. She had grown too close to him, had come to depend on him in ways she hadn't anticipated. And as much as she wanted to spare him from the danger, she knew that he wasn't going anywhere. "They said I'd regret it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're going to hurt us, Mr. Henry. I don't know how we can stop them." "We'll stop them together," he said firmly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We're in this together now." And just like that, everything shifted. The hopelessness that had consumed her, the fear that had suffocated her, began to unravel. She wasn't alone. She had someone by her side, a man who had fought battles, faced down enemies far worse than the ones they now faced. Together, they had a chance. With that small act of solidarity, they forged a new path, one where fear had no place. But the road ahead would be anything but easy. The loan sharks wouldn't back down easily, and there was no telling how far they would go to protect their interests. But Maria was done running. And with Mr. Henry by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The plan was set in motion. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to fall into place, and no matter how dangerous the journey ahead would be, Maria and Mr. Henry were ready. For the first time in months, Maria felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of light in the dark. She had found someone she could trust, someone who would stand by her when everything else seemed to fall apart. And as they prepared for what was to come, Maria couldn't help but wonder, had the universe been trying to bring them together all along? Had it taken the threat of destruction for her to finally realize that she didn't have to face it all alone? Only time would tell. But for now, one thing was certain, this fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. And with Mr. Henry at her side, Maria was ready to face it head-on. As the days rolled on, Maria and Mr. Henry's partnership grew stronger. What began as a fragile alliance, formed out of necessity, soon blossomed into an unspoken bond, one based on mutual respect and shared resolve. But with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. The loan sharks, aware that they were no longer dealing with an easy target, had escalated their threats. Every time Maria picked up her phone, there was the unsettling suspicion that it was another veiled threat, another ominous warning. Each knock on her door sent her heart into overdrive. Maria had always been strong, but this constant state of fear was wearing on her. She had to remain vigilant, never knowing when or how the next blow might come. But it wasn't just the fear of the loan sharks that plagued her, it was the fear that her situation had become so much bigger than she had anticipated. She no longer felt in control. It was as though her life had been hijacked, and she was now a passenger, subject to the whims of forces far beyond her control. Yet, in the midst of all this chaos, Mr. Henry's steady presence grounded her. There was something about him that gave her hope, even on the darkest of days. Maybe it was the quiet strength in his eyes, or the way he seemed to approach every obstacle with a calm determination. He never showed fear. And, more importantly, he never treated Maria as a victim. He saw her as an equal, someone capable of fighting back. Despite his military background, Mr. Henry was no stranger to the consequences of violence. He had fought wars, seen countless lives torn apart by conflict, but he had never faced an enemy quite like this. The loan sharks were not soldiers on a battlefield, they were a different breed of menace, cunning and unpredictable. The way they twisted their power, using fear and intimidation as their primary weapons, made them seem like ghosts, impossible to track, impossible to predict. They had to be careful. Every step they took could bring them one step closer to losing everything, and they both knew it. One day, Maria found herself sitting at a small diner, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, her mind drifting between thoughts of strategy and fear. She could feel the weight of it all, the pressure to act quickly before the sharks decided to take more drastic measures. She hadn't told Mr. Henry the full extent of the threats. The idea of putting him in even greater danger gnawed at her, and she didn't want him to know just how deep this hole went. He had already risked so much for her, and she wasn't sure how much more he could take. As she sipped her coffee, her gaze lifted to the front door, where the bell above it chimed as someone entered. Maria froze for a moment as her eyes locked on a familiar face. Her breath caught in her throat. It was one of the men she had seen in the loan shark's office, the man who had been there when she signed the papers that started this whole nightmare. He was walking toward her, his eyes dark and cold, a look of menace in his posture. Her heart hammered in her chest. The man didn't speak. He simply slid into the booth across from her, his eyes boring into hers with the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. "Maria," he said with a calmness that sent shivers down her spine. "We know what you're up to. We're done playing games. It's time for you to settle your debt." Maria felt a chill run through her veins. She could almost hear her pulse thundering in her ears. She fought to steady her breath, to keep the fear from showing on her face. "I've told you before, I don't have the money. You're going to have to." "You're not listening," the man interrupted, his voice low and threatening. "We've given you enough chances. You think this is just about money? It's not. It's about power. And right now, you're on the wrong side of it." Maria's mind raced. She had to think fast. This wasn't just a negotiation, it was a warning. She had to get out of this situation without triggering more violence, without making things worse for herself or Mr. Henry. She tried to steady her shaking hands, her eyes darting toward the door, but the man was blocking her exit. "You don't understand," she said, trying to sound confident, even though her voice was trembling. "This isn't just about me anymore. I have someone who's helping me. Someone who can protect me." The man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Protect you? You think one old man can stand up to us?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I'd rethink that if I were you. We don't just make threats, Maria. We follow through." For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Maria's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to get to Mr. Henry without letting this man know what was really going on. She had no choice but to keep him talking, to buy time. She had to play it smart. But before she could respond, the door to the diner swung open again, and to Maria's utter relief, Mr. Henry stepped inside. He didn't see the man immediately, but his presence alone changed the dynamic in the room. He didn't need to say anything. The mere sight of him, his calm but unyielding demeanor, was enough to make the man across from Maria falter, just for a split second. The days after that confrontation were a mix of relief and unease. Maria and Mr. Henry knew that while the loan sharks had temporarily retreated, they had not won. It was merely a battle in a war that was far from over. As much as Maria wanted to feel safe, the reality was that the threats were still out there. The phone calls had stopped for now, but Maria knew they would return, perhaps more aggressively. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting, watching, plotting their next move. For Mr. Henry, the tension was palpable. He had seen violence, endured the horrors of war, but this was something different. The loan sharks were shadows in the city, able to slip in and out without being caught. They didn't fight with guns or knives, they fought with fear, with threats, with manipulation. And that made them all the more dangerous. One evening, as Maria and Mr. Henry sat on the front porch of her house, sipping on warm cups of coffee, they heard the faint sound of a car pulling up. Maria's heart skipped a beat, her nerves instantly on edge. It was too late for anyone to be visiting. She glanced at Mr. Henry, his eyes narrowing as he stood up. His posture was calm, but there was a definite tension in the air. Before Maria could say anything, the front door opened, and a man stepped onto the porch. He wasn't someone Maria recognized, but his face was hard and weathered, the kind of face that had seen too many battles. He wore a suit, though it was slightly rumpled, as though he had been in a hurry. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. "Mr. Henry?" the man asked, his voice low, almost cautious. Mr. Henry didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the man, sizing him up in an instant. "Who are you?" The man paused for a moment, then took a step forward. "I'm here to talk about the loan sharks. You've stirred things up more than you know." His words were direct, but there was an underlying respect in his tone, as though he had been forced to acknowledge something he hadn't planned for. "I'm from a group that's been tracking them for years. We've had our eyes on their operations for some time." Maria looked at Mr. Henry, confused. She had no idea who this man was or why he was here. But she trusted Mr. Henry, and his calm demeanor told her that this was no ordinary visit. "The loan sharks are not just some street thugs," the man continued, his voice dropping lower, as though afraid someone might overhear. "They're connected. Bigger than you realize. They have a lot of power, and they're well protected." Maria's stomach twisted. She had known that the sharks were dangerous, but hearing it in such clear terms made it all the more real. She couldn't fathom what Mr. Henry had been holding back. She could see it in his eyes, he was no stranger to danger, but even this was different. "And what do you want with us?" Mr. Henry asked, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet anger. He had made a promise to protect Maria, and he wasn't about to back down now. The man seemed to hesitate, then took a deep breath. "I came to offer you a choice. Help us take down the sharks, expose their operations, their leaders, everything, and we can make sure they leave you alone. Or," he paused, his expression hardening, "you keep fighting them, and we'll all be in danger." Maria's mind raced. A part of her wanted to push back, to refuse the idea of working with anyone who could get them tangled deeper into this mess. But another part of her, the part that had lived in fear for so long, understood the gravity of the situation. She couldn't keep running from the sharks. Not forever. The longer she fought alone, the more it would cost her, and everyone around her. Mr. Henry stepped forward, his eyes unwavering. "We're not afraid of them," he said simply. The man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're stronger than most," he muttered, almost to himself. "But sometimes, strength doesn't win wars. Strategy does." The conversation ended there, but the tension remained thick between them. The man didn't give his name, nor did he offer any more details about the group he represented. Instead, he just turned and walked away, leaving Maria and Mr. Henry standing in the yard, caught in the middle of something far larger than either of them had expected. For the next few days, the weight of his words hung over them. Maria felt trapped in a world she didn't understand. She had thought that by standing up to the sharks, she had gained control over her life again. But now she saw that the sharks were only a symptom of a much larger, more dangerous machine. There were layers of corruption, power, and influence that extended far beyond what she could see, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it all. Still, Mr. Henry's resolve didn't waver. He continued to train her, both physically and mentally, preparing for whatever came next. They spent long hours working together, learning how to defend themselves, how to read the situation around them, how to stay one step ahead. But Maria could sense that something was different now. The stakes had been raised. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their freedom, and perhaps for more than that. One night, just as Maria was preparing to turn in for bed, her phone buzzed. It was a text message. She hesitated before opening it, already fearing the worst. The message was short and to the point: "We know who you are. You can't hide forever." Her blood ran cold. The loan sharks weren't going to let this go. They had made their threats clear, but now, with the added complication of the mysterious group, everything was in flux. Maria had to make a decision, whether to play it safe and try to retreat into the shadows, or whether to risk it all and confront the darkness head-on. She knew what Mr. Henry would say. He would say to stand tall, to fight back. But was it the right decision? Would they be walking straight into a trap? As the hours ticked by, Maria realized something that had eluded her until now: she wasn't just afraid of the loan sharks. She was afraid of losing the control she had fought so hard to regain. She was afraid of being swallowed whole by a world that she didn't understand, a world where fear ruled and power was wielded by unseen hands. But then she thought of Mr. Henry, of the bond they had formed. If she was going to face this battle, she wouldn't face it alone. And that thought, that simple truth, gave her the courage to face whatever came next. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Maria made her decision. She would confront the loan sharks head-on. She wouldn't cower. And she wouldn't let them take her down without a fight. The game had changed, and Maria was done running. She was ready to take the next step. Ready to face whatever came her way. And with Mr. Henry by her side, she felt stronger than ever before.